When we think about the term culture, what comes to mind? Religious rituals, cultural dances, whatever image comes to your mind, for you likely requires a qualifier in order for it to be described. When you describe that culture, you realize that it is different from cultures around the world. It is unique. So what are the fundamentals of culture beyond the external products, like dances and rituals? According to Samovar and Porter in Communications Between Cultures, deep structure institutions form our notions about right and wrong, why there is suffering, what to expect from life, where your loyalties lie, and how to prepare for death. These structures are both what make a culture unique and shape our identities. They are known as the deep structure institutions and include family, religion, and state. And exploring deep culture institutions, the country I'm going to be talking about is Japan. Japan is a series of islands in the Pacific Ocean off the east coast of China. And according to Oxford Encyclopedia of the Modern World by Peter N. Stearns, between 1603 and 1867, Japan existed in a state of isolationism known as the Tokugawa period. This period of history, according to Stearns, has captured the popular imagination as a golden age of peace and prosperity, and is celebrated as the fullest expression of native Japanese culture before the arrival of Western imperialism. During this time, Japan was ruled by the military leader known as the shogun, who centralized control of Japan after emerging victorious from a nationwide civil war. This period of isolationism ended with the arrival of Commodore Matthew Perry in 1853, who forced the opening of Japan to the Western world. Japan quickly modernized in what's called the Meiji Restoration and became a formidable power. After World War I, it received an honorable position at the Treaty of Versailles. And what followed was an increase in nationalism and aggression toward its Asian neighbors in what was to create the greater Asian prosperity sphere. Moving into World War II, Japan would be one of the aggressors. And after a long and brutal conflict, it became apparent that the Japanese would rather sacrifice every man, woman, and child than surrender. As a result, the United States dropped the first atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which convinced the emperor to surrender. So, this history is very important in understanding the deep structure institutions of Japanese culture. And that first structure is family. According to Anne Imamura, in her article The Japanese Family, published in 1990 as part of the journal Asia Society, for much of the 20th century, the ideal Japanese family was known as the ie, which is also known as the agricultural household. So some things that are, some characteristics of the ie include strict gender-based role division with a patriarchal head, meaning it's a man's world. A hierarchy by birth, so children were ranked from oldest to youngest, with the oldest child taking over as head of the household and being in charge of managing the family's affairs. Imamura notes that the ie includes all people residing in the household, not just blood relatives, thus providing a model for family-style relations extending beyond the family and creating a model for which second, third, and fourth born children can find their own place in Japanese society by joining other ies. Imamura continues, the husband's primary role in the household was as the breadwinner. So this includes long hours away from home, minimal contact with children, limited to weekends. And the husband is generally viewed as a disruption in the scheduling and the harmony of the household that is set forth by the wife and the children. For a man in the typical Japanese household, most interpersonal relationships are with their coworkers, colleagues, and former classmates. Whereas for the wife, the primary role is to attend to the scheduling of the children, attend to the husband's needs when he arrives home from work, and most of her interpersonal relationships were and are with other housewives in the neighborhood, including mothers of their children's friends. Imamura observed that the husband and wife essentially lead separate lives, up until the point when the husband retired and then the social lives came together. The second structure is the state. Now, according to a University of Florida article published on their cultural studies page, social ranking and status play a part in many major institutions that one goes in throughout their lifetime. So age is a very important classifier and indication of status that determines everything from where your desk is going to be located to when, in what order you'll be served tea at a tea ceremony. In regards to status and communication, inferior partners, so people of a lower status, defer to the superior in order to save the superior any humiliation and to prevent them from losing face. And again, that's from the Basics of Japanese Culture on the University of Florida's page. Now, another aspect of the Japanese relationship with the state is the concept of national identity. I mentioned that Japan, between the periods of World War I and World War II, became increasingly nationalistic. Now, this is actually something that was in the works in Japan from the beginning of its history. Much of the national identity in Japan is based on racial purity. Japan grew up as an isolated island. During the Tokugawa period, it had very little interaction with the outside world. And there has been a history of political efforts to create a Japanese mythology of racial purity. If you are Japanese, you are superior, says the powers that be. So within Japanese society, there is very little emphasis placed on the individual. Instead, people derive their worth and usefulness from their ability to work as part of a team. It's a collectivist culture. This applies to the relationship between the Japanese and the state, in which collectivism, the good of the whole, outweighs the good of the individual. So the culture of the state, according to the article, Japan's identity and what it means, collectivism in Japan means that harmony must be respected. So in Japan, arriving at a consensus for decision-making is much more important, especially with as little friction and dispute as possible. It's a fundamental rule in Japan, and a political culture imbued with this principle makes it tough to affect major changes in society. So the third and final structure is religion. Japan actually has two religions that exist in harmony, Shinto and Buddhism. Shinto was the earliest Japanese religion. It focused on the worship of natural spirits that affect good fortune. According to Paul Watt in the journal Asia Society's Focus on Asian Studies, Volume 2, Number 1, the word Shinto means the way of the kami, and so kami are the gods and spirits. There is no dogma or scripture or specific religious philosophy in Shinto. Instead, Shinto's it views the world as a very fundamentally bright and optimistic religion, and it focuses on the celebration and the enrichment of life rather than telling you how to live and how to worship. Worship in Shinto is done both publicly and privately. It's done in the form of festivals, religious festivals that happen annually, as well as more subdued and private at the neighborhood Shinto shrine. The second religion is Buddhism. Now, Buddhism is based on the 5 basic truths. Life is suffering, that suffering has a cause, that suffering can come to an end, and the end to suffering can only be found by following the Eightfold Path. Now, the Eightfold Path is it's a series of tenements to be followed, similar to the 10 Commandments of the Judeo-Christian faith. Now, clearly, Buddhism is much more structured than Shintoism. But Watt writes that Buddhism also brought an enormous canon of religious literature, an elaborate body of doctrine, a well-organized priesthood, and a dazzling tradition of religious art and architecture. Now, this begs the question, how do the two religions coexist? Now, originally the Japanese saw Buddha as just another kami. There was no animosity towards this new religion, and people were drawn to it because of the religious architecture, which was in line with the attraction to Shintoism to begin with. Eventually, however, the kami began to be seen as different manifestations of the Buddha, and that Shinto and Buddhism were complete versions of the same fundamental truth, which is a view that gained lots of popularity and acceptance in Japan to this day, and individuals tend to practice both Buddhism being a more formal religion, with Shinto being a more day-to-day manifestation of luck and good fortune. So in conclusion, Japanese culture is complex. It can be described as collectivist, with living in harmony. The good of the people and the common good is much more important than the achievements of the individual. Now, the deep culture structures of family, state, and religion are what make this culture vibrant and unique. Thank you.